Greetings, class. I wanted to help you with this discussion and go over the components of a motherboard. Here I have a motherboard that's labeled, and we're going to go over some of these slots here so that you can understand best what they're used for. So the first one we're going to go over is slot A. That's a PCI slot. The board has two PCI slots, and these can be used for items such as Ethernet cards, sound cards, modems. The PCI Express card is a slot B. Those are generally more used nowadays than the PCI slot card. The PCI slot cards seem to be a little bit harder to find today. So the PCI card, or the PCI Express card, again, it's the same thing, graphics, network cards nowadays. And this is a PCI 16, PCI Express 16 slot. Here's a PCI Express smaller one. These are again probably taking over the industry to be a little bit smaller. And again, these have these can hold Ethernet cards, sound cards, whatsoever. So then we're going to go into D, and D is the North Bridge. The purpose of the North Bridge is to allow communication to the central processing unit and the system memory. So the North Bridge controls that communication. E is just a power connection. There's usually two on the board. That goes to your power supply so that the motherboard does get power. F is a plug for the CPU fan. The fan for the CPU is generally pretty important. And of course, the CPU is probably one of the most important components of the motherboard as it controls speed and it's the brains for that. But G is where the CPU would sit, or the CPU socket would, that's the socket. The CPU sits on top of that socket. And there's little locking levers here. And then generally, a fan will go right on top of that CPU and this CPU socket, and that plugs into F. H is where, in this particular instance, you could put memory. This particular unit has 4 slots for memory. It used to be back in the day where you had to pair them. So if you put one in this blue slot, you had to put another in the blue slot. They don't have to be paired like that anymore. You can just have one in the blue slot. But if you put 2 in there, more than likely there's a diagram on the laptop where it'd say, okay, this is A1 and this is B1, and this is A2 and this is B2. You have to have A1 and B1 paired and A2 and B2 paired if you have more than one component. So it's important to pay attention to how that RAM goes in. There's also a limitation on RAM. For example, I can't buy 4 32 gig sticks and expect this motherboard to have that type of capacity to allow 64 times 64 gigs of, or 64 to 64, 128 gigs of RAM on this. There is a limitation, so you do have to understand what those specs are. I here is another power connector to that power supply. J is an IDE connection, so it's the old hard drive connection. Most now come with SSD or SATA drives or PCI Express, and I showed you, or if you haven't heard, there's a SSD called NVMe that works in this PCI Express, and usually that's turned sideways and it slips in like RAM for laptops. But the big thing about that is that drive is not limited to that speed of that connection anymore. So the SATA connection did have a limit. The PCI Express has a limit, but the PCI Express is much more faster. K is the South Bridge, which controls USB communications with USB and audio. L here is connections for SATA drives. And this obviously is a desktop motherboard, right? Because usually you'll plug in and that'll sit into the tower in the case, and the RAM sits up in this. And laptops now are turned sideways where you're sliding them in, then are running parallel to the motherboard. So this is a desktop motherboard. M is where your lights are controlled on your tower, so you get a power light or whatever. It's plugging into this connection. And you probably won't see anymore, but that's the floppy disk drive connection, or it used to be the floppy disk drive connection. O is your USB connections. And then P right here, that's the CMOS battery. So a lot of times it holds and retains the information for your BIOS, your date time. So you could just unplug and replug that to reset that. Sometimes that's part of troubleshooting steps that helps. So that's the components of the motherboard, and I hope this helps. Thanks.